Story 1, my high school, which was on the flight path for an Air Force base. Hearing the entire squadron of fighter jets take off in quick succession in a way that they had never done before and not knowing why was absolutely unnerving. Story 2. I was on Camp Pendleton with my dad when September 11th happened at his office. He was in the service. He sat me in the building and said, "Your mom will get here at some point, but I have to go." And that was that. I didn't see him again for about 6 months. Story 3. Got up from a night shift to go to the bathroom, and my brother happened to be watching it in his bedroom. I glanced in the door and said, "What's this nonsense you're watching?" I genuinely thought he was watching a movie, and I remember him vividly saying, "I was just about to wake you up. It's really happening, brother." Story 4. From Northern Ireland, I remember being in our living room doing homework with the babysitter and watching Ed, and Eddie when my parents flew in the front door and changed the channel to British Broadcasting Corporation News and a clip of the towers burning. Story 5. I was meant to be at work on Wall Street and would have been coming out of the Fulton Street station, right by the World Trade Center, when the first plane hit. However, I took my mother to New York City for a surprise first trip there since 1968. We live in New Zealand, so I had a week off work to spend with her. We flew in on September 9th, 2001. On the morning of the 10th, I said, "What do you want to do first?" She said, "When I was last here, the Twin Towers were being built, and I thought when I left that I'd love to go up to the top when they are finished. So, I'd like to do that." That's how I found myself standing on the observation deck of one of the Twin Towers at around 3 p.m. on September 10th, 2001. The next morning, I looked out my apartment window. We were staying a 10-minute walk from the World Trade Center and saw that the towers were on fire. I genuinely thought I was dreaming and tried to wake myself up. Story 6. Boating on a lake with friends, disconnected from the world. We had no idea what happened until we all got home. Thought it was weird that every gas station had a long line. Story 7. In elementary school, we all gathered in the large central area in the middle of the classrooms. All the adults were watching the news on one of those roll-away box TV carts. I remember they were trying to decide whether to send us home or not and manage the logistics of having hundreds of children during a time of crisis. I think we were sent home a couple of hours early. I watched it on the news with my parents, seeing people jumping out of buildings and such. Everyone was very scared. I almost wish I could thank the teachers who took care of us. They really stepped up in a way that wasn't expected of them. They could have just fled to their own families. They probably weren't much older than I am now. It's crazy to think about. Story 8. Getting ready for work. We routinely had the morning news on as we ate breakfast, and on September 11th, we stared at the television in disbelief. We thought it was an accident until the second tower was hit. Then we were concerned that we were at war. Story 9. ExxonMobil plant in Baton Rouge. It's considered to be a high-priority target during an attack. They immediately locked it down and requested the National Guard to guard all the gates. We were put on lockdown. No one was allowed in or out all day. Story 10. This is from a teenager's perspective and experience. I was 15. I had stayed up all night not doing my schoolwork, complicated situation, was homeschooled in the loosest of terms, and watching anime. My young siblings had woken up, and I came out to watch them while my mother slept. We had been watching kids' shows on PBS, but something annoying came on, and I switched to the news for a while. The Today Show was on. We all watched it from the beginning when they cut in about a small plane hitting the World Trade Center. There was confusion and concern, of course, but it was just like any news story. It was probably a very unfortunate accident, right? And then the second plane hit. We all watched until the second tower fell when my mom finally got up and shut the television off and yelled at me for letting the kids watch that. I moved to my bedroom and was glued to the television for the next 48 hours, no sleep. We lived on a flight path, and the silence from the shutdown of all flights was so strange. When I finally did sleep, I dreamed of being trapped in the stairwells over and over. It was probably my age showing naivety, but up until that point, the world I lived in was relatively safe. It was my home life that was dangerous. Yes, bad things happened, but not like this. Not in America. Shook me to the core. There was a huge swell in patriotism, but it also ignited anti-Muslim sentiment across the country that also affected people like Sikhs and Hindus because people whipped up into their frenzies couldn't tell the difference. It was a scary time. Then the war on terror started. Iraq and Afghanistan sent my generation to fight. I got recruitment calls weekly until I told them I was gay and would not hide who I was to die for a country that didn't respect me. They stopped calling after that. It was a traumatic day that set in motion many terrible things. Yes, good things did come of it, like removing Saddam from power. But was that really our responsibility? And now, seeing the end of the Afghan occupation, it's hard to think about those who lost their lives or limbs and who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder from their time there. It really does seem like it was all for absolutely nothing. The women are just as oppressed as ever, the Taliban is still in power, we abandoned many who were allies to us. What did we even achieve? Hundreds of thousands dead between Iraq and Afghanistan, all for the actions of a few on one day in September. It's a tough thing to think about and difficult to come to a conclusion if in the end it was even worth it. Story 11. I was working the night shift. I woke around 11 a.m. and started moving around the house. I had a radio in the bathroom on a plug connected to the light switch, so it came on automatically with the light. I went in to shave, so I had the light on, and my favorite music was replaced by the middle of a news bulletin. I had to listen for a few minutes to understand what was even going on. When I finally heard enough to comprehend what was happening, I went into the living room and stayed glued to the television all day until it was time to leave for work. I was in my early 40s at the time. Story 12. Working security in a courthouse minutes away, I was brushing my teeth when I felt the first plane fly over. It flew low enough to be felt in my building. A radio call of "Fire! Fire!" went out seconds later. Replies of "Location" weren't answered. I ran downstairs to exit the building when I saw the damaged tower. That began one of the longest days of my life. Story 13. I was in school. I was doing my math as quickly as I could so I could do quiet reading when my teacher got a phone call at her desk. She immediately turned on the television in the corner of the classroom, usually a rare treat so we could watch a video, but it was just a bunch of news people talking. As I was undiagnosed autistic and didn't care since it would keep me from getting to my quiet reading, I returned to my schoolwork and didn't see the plane hit the second tower. Only after I got home were things explained. Story 14. Canadian here. I was in grade 7 in the computer lab. I remember them wheeling the TV in, and even at 12 years old, I can remember feeling shocked and knowing how serious it was. I'll never forget how the environment in that room went from laughter and chaos to complete silence. The rest of the day was that way. I remember feeling proud of my country for stepping up and getting involved in Afghanistan. Fast forward to today, and it's pretty disappointing to see where our country's relationships have gone, such as tariffs, among other issues. Story 15. I was 21 working construction on a house when I heard it on the radio. To this day, when I drive by that house, I remember it as the September 11th house. One of the few houses I remember working on. Story 16. I was on a business trip for a meeting halfway across the country from my home. We went into crisis mode because where I worked was an organization that would be involved in emergencies at the national level. Fortunately, we had most of the people together in one location, which allowed us to work effectively without the modern web meeting tools today. As soon as I heard that all the flights were grounded, I called the rental car company and told them that I was changing my drop-off location to back home. The woman couldn't understand why I would want to return it thousands of miles away, but I knew how it was going to play out. After the meeting, I drove back halfway across the country, dropping colleagues off at their homes along the way. Meanwhile, we spent the time in the car having meeting calls with the one phone that had a speaker function sitting on the console. Story 17. On the D train on the bridge from Lower Manhattan into Brooklyn, I worked in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, at the time 25th Street and 3rd Avenue, just on the waterfront, with a direct view of the destruction that morning. Stood on all the cars after the towers fell. I remember it like it was yesterday. Story 18. In a school staff meeting, my mom called the school, and she never did that unless it was an emergency. She was crying. We all left school, went home, and hugged our kids and loved ones. Story 19. On an express bus on the way to work down Queens Boulevard, It was a regular morning. On the highway to the tunnel, we saw the first building smoking, and someone on the bus said a plane had crashed into the building. Coming out of the tunnel in the East 30s, the city was in mayhem because the second plane had hit by then. I ended up walking home. It was a blue sky, mild Tuesday, and I went to the local bar for a few hours when I got back to my neighborhood. Story 20. On my couch, skipping school, playing Pokemon Silver. My mom walked in, turned off my Game Boy, and said, "You will remember this day forever." Still mad she did not let me save first. Story 21. In Washington, D.C., working for the Federal Aviation Administration. I called out because I was sick and woke up to see the planes on live TV. We couldn't wrap our heads around what we were seeing. I am not a particularly patriotic person, yet in the following days, I went on a mission looking for an American flag. It took me a few more days to shake that and realize this was not an ideal time for me to begin to blindly trust the government. I quit that job and left Washington, D.C. shortly after. Story 22. I turned 4 years old on September 11th. I remember it vividly as it was my consciousness awakening moment. I was at a soft play ball pit center with all of my school class in year 1. I remember my mom, my grandma, my friend's mom, and the ball pit center staff huddled around the TV, and I remember watching the second tower get hit. Then we had birthday cake. Story 23. I was working in a nursing home, and everyone just so happened to be sitting around the television watching the news. I will never forget that moment and the look on the residents' faces. Story 24. 3rd grade. West Coast, so all the plane crashes had already happened by the time I woke up. I remember going downstairs for breakfast, and my mom was talking to her sister on the phone in a panicked voice, talking about how, "This is one of those days that will go down in history." School that day was weird. My teacher was pretty obviously checked out and distraught, so she had us write a letter to our future selves about that day and how it made us feel. We spent the rest of the day playing board games, so that was cool at least. I remember going home that night and flipping through channels and seeing that a lot of them had ended their broadcast for the day out of respect for the victims. I was upset that the usual back-to-back Simpsons and King of the Hill slot on Channel Q13 Fox in Seattle had been preempted for news coverage. I played Crash Team Racing instead. To see through the eyes of a child. Story 25. 10th grade economics class. My teacher turned the television on, stopped teaching, and told everyone to watch. That this moment and this day would change our lives forever. I remember the multiple replays over and over. Story 26. I was on the train heading into New York City. The first plane hit right as my train was pulling in to pick us up. A friend's dad called her and told her not to get on the train, but I was already on with another friend, so we missed getting off. I found out what was happening with a call to a friend who I knew was home with her kids. The second plane hit when we were on the phone. I could have gotten off in Newark, but for some reason I didn't. I made it into Penn Station, heard a police officer say, "The next train out is the last train out." I jumped on it and saw the towers fall as we were pulling out of the tunnel back on the New Jersey side. Story 27. Leaving the house for a meeting in South Jersey. I live an hour away from New York City, but I was born in the boroughs, and my wife worked in the World Trade Center but left before the attacks. Lost a dear friend and a symbol of New York and America all in the same day. Still can't talk about it without getting choked up. Story 28. Training to be an assistant manager at a gas station. I never worked the day shift, but I was scheduled to for a couple of hours that morning so I could learn the paperwork. Customers kept coming and asking us if we had heard about what happened, and we were clueless until the manager's husband came in and filled us in. I came back from my closing shift that night, and we were the busiest we had ever been. Cars were lined up out to the road. People were filling up everything imaginable with gasoline because there was talk of it going up to $5 per gallon overnight. All 3 of our underground tanks ran dry, and people were getting mad at me because I could not just call for an instant delivery. Story 29. On a small trading floor in Boston, we watched it unfold on a large screen TV. Our head trader was on the phone with someone at Cantor Fitzgerald in the second building after the first plane hit, who was saying they were told not to evacuate and to hang tight. Then the second plane hit and the phone went dead. Cantor Fitzgerald was hit directly by the second plane. That's when our boss told us to go home to our families. Story 30, third grade. I'm from Denmark, so the attack was in the early afternoon here. I remember it was a beautiful sunny day because when I came home from school, my parents were indoors watching the news about what was happening. On such a nice day, they would always be out in the garden when I got home from school, so this was very unusual. I remember the next day in school, our teacher explained what had happened, and that we had a minute of silence.